What do Scott Morrison and Anthony Albanese have in common? Well, the answer might be far more than any of us would like, being two wings of the same Uniparty bird. But in particular, I'm talking about something this week that they directly have in common, and that is their desire to protect the mainstream legacy media lobby. Now, why do I say this? In the news recently, we've seen Anthony Albanese announce a new policy that he's going to put before the Parliament called the Media Bargaining Incentive. Now, what does this mean? Well, you guessed it, incentive is a code for tax. And this isn't really a new policy priority for either major party. You might remember, so this media bargaining incentive might sound a bit familiar, ring a few bells. And the reason for that is that during the last year of the COVID lockdowns, Scott Morrison and the then coalition government introduced something called the Media Bargaining Code. Now, that Media Bargaining Code was an initiative or a system that was designed to basically charge social media companies for Australian news media content that they provided or made available on their social media platforms. So the idea was, and remains, to essentially prop up the failing business model of what I'm going to call legacy media. So I'm not going to call them mainstream media because I don't think they're really that mainstream anymore. But mainstream media, legacy media, have been super concerned. They're seeing social media, they're seeing new media, alternative commentators like this channel arise to challenge their former dominance. And they're trying to essentially, what they call it leveling the playing field, but really they're trying to raise barriers to entry and keep out competitors, which they used to be able to do through owning the networks, through owning the technology. Now that new technology makes online journalism and lower cost competitors super easy, that's not something they can rely on to keep competitors out anymore and to keep their bottom lines healthy. So they've turned to, you guessed it, big daddy government. And they, in 2022, introduced this news media bargaining code. Now, what happened in response to that was something that was pretty spectacular, because this was in Victoria, especially where I was at the time. This was at the height of Daniel Andrews going on news every day, and most people were seeing this news through Facebook and other social media platforms. And he was telling people the updates of, whether we'd achieved donuts or 0 cases that day, or what the new case count was. And people were just addicted to tuning in to see Daniel Andrews give us this propaganda broadcast. And right in the middle of that, this media bargaining code got announced, and Facebook and other platforms basically said, okay, you want us to pay if there's Australian news content on our platforms? We're not going to have Australian news content on our platforms. It was this amazing Atlas Shrugged moment, like Ayn Rand's famous book, where the social media platforms just said, okay, we're out. And for a brief window, about 7 to 10 days, there was this glorious moment where Australia was like North Korea in terms of what news content it could access from its own country on these social media platforms. And that caught the government by surprise, and they panicked, and essentially they watered down significantly the provisions, and basically social media companies hadn't had to pay, or had to pay only a very nominal amount since that was introduced, because this media bargaining code, media bargaining code was basically voluntary. Like, if you want to have the content, then you pay. And what that meant was negotiated down, because the social media companies could bypass it by just saying, we're not going to have the content. So last week, Anthony Albanese announced this incentive tax, which is proposing to basically charge 2.25% of the revenue generated in Australia by social media companies like X, Facebook, and others. We'll come back to that in a second. If they don't enter into a voluntary agreement to pay Australian legacy media for their content, for the news content they produce. So this essentially eliminates that backdoor where it makes the default setting tax incentive if an agreement isn't reached. So they're trying to eliminate that backdoor where the social media companies could put pressure, and they're saying, okay, whether or not you want this news content, we're going to charge you this fee. And if you don't want to pay that fee, you have to enter into an agreement with the Australian companies. So it's going to be really, really interesting, especially because since that time, Elon Musk has bought X, and the social media companies have learned they can flex their muscle, And there's also been a big shift in what Australians expect in terms of how and when they can access their news. So this is a flagrant cash grab. It's also flagrant protectionism. And those two things taken together form the absolute meat and vegetables of both major parties in terms of their social media policy over the last probably about half a decade or more. Because they're desperate for cash, and they also want to run a protection racket for their mates in the legacy media who run plenty of advertisements for them and so on during election time. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think it's fair that Australian social media companies should pay a 2.25% tax? I think that a response to this is going to be a restructuring of how Australian social media companies define their revenue and raise money or make revenue in Australia. And I think they're going to resist this very strongly. And I think they're going to potentially make arguments around the implied freedom of political communication. And yeah, it's going to be very, very interesting to see. I think it's going to be a huge fight. So let me know what you think. If you like this video, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and share this with anyone you know who wants up-to-date, calm, easy to understand explanations of what's going on in the news and Australian politics and abroad. Talk to you soon.